On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland with an army carrying approximately 6 weeks of ammunition. The war that army started would last 2,077 days. The men who understood what those numbers meant changed nothing. The Polish book changed nothing. This is not the story of... And what that video didn't answer is why 1939 specifically. Why not hold course until the Wehrmacht was actually ready, until the U-boat fleet had the boats it needed, until the panzer divisions were fully equipped, until the currency reserves had recovered? The answer is that by that summer, delay had become more dangerous than war. Subscribe if you want the history that explains why. This is that channel. The version of events most people carry goes something like this. Hitler spent 6 years methodically rebuilding German power, remilitarizing the Rhineland, absorbing Austria, dismembering Czechoslovakia. Each move carefully calibrated, each bloodless victory confirming that the Western democracies would not fight. By 1939, flush with confidence and commanding the most feared military in Europe, he made the calculated decision to launch a general war from a position of overwhelming strength. The timing was his choice. Germany had never been more prepared. This version isn't wrong exactly. The military buildup was real. The territorial acquisitions were real. The Western democracies did consistently fail to respond. And the Wehrmacht that crossed into Poland was genuinely a revolutionary military instrument. Panzer divisions operating on combined arms principles that French and British doctrine hadn't yet absorbed. A command culture built on decentralized initiative that gave junior officers authority their Allied counterparts didn't have. The myth earns its credibility because Germany's early victories were spectacular enough to make the preparation look complete. France fell in 46 days. Poland collapsed in 5 weeks. The performance looked like the product of years of careful readiness. But that version of events has one problem. It assumes Germany had time. It assumes Hitler was choosing when to start the war. What if, by that point, that choice had already been made for him, not by strategy, but by the apparatus he'd built? From inside the German war economy, it looked considerably more desperate. The men who knew it best spent the years before September 1939 writing documents they hoped Hitler would read and act on. He read them. He didn't act on them. He invaded anyway. Hjalmar Schacht placed his resignation on Hitler's desk in November 1937 and walked out of the Reich Economics Ministry for the last time. He had built the shadow financing scheme that made Germany's rearmament invisible to the outside world. He understood what he'd built better than anyone alive. He was leaving because he believed the whole construction was about to give way. By 1937, the hidden debt had reached roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks, and it was maturing. Germany had no mechanism to retire it without triggering the kind of unraveling that would expose the entire economic miracle as a fraud. The currency reserves confirmed it. Germany entered 1933 with roughly 800 million Reichsmarks in gold and foreign exchange. By early 1939, those holdings had been consumed to a fraction of that level, enough to finance a few months of normal international trade at best. And for a while, there was a solution. The spending didn't slow after Schacht left. It accelerated. The only way to service the debt was to keep seizing, and the primary source of new foreign exchange was territorial seizure. This is where expansion stopped being just politics and became financial survival. When the Wehrmacht entered Vienna in 1938, Reichsbank officials followed immediately behind the tanks, not to administer the occupation, but to seize Austria's gold. $99 million, roughly 245 million Reichsmarks, transferred to Berlin within weeks. It was a geopolitical union and a state-sponsored bank robbery conducted simultaneously. The forced absorption of Czechoslovakia the following year added another 83 million Reichsmarks in seized assets. Each acquisition bought the program a few more months, but by the summer of 1939, that math had stopped working. The obligations were growing faster than the territory. General Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office, had been producing internal reports laying out how far Germany's ambitions outran its actual capacity. His conclusion was blunt. Germany was not prepared for a long war. It was barely prepared for a short one. None of it changed the timeline. The standard explanation for Germany's economic recklessness is Hitler's ideology, his belief in racial destiny, his contempt for conventional economic reasoning, his certainty that willpower could substitute for logistics. That explanation isn't wrong, but it misses something structural. It was a structure that could only function by moving forward. Stopping didn't mean stabilizing. Stopping meant the whole construction turning on itself. The internal documents from 1938 and 1939 show not just military planners arguing about readiness, but financial officials warning that a peaceful consolidation of existing gains would expose the hidden unemployment, the suppressed inflation, and the paper-thin gold reserves that had been concealed for 6 years. Some historians argue the regime was equally terrified of its own people, that without foreign plunder, the working class that had lived through 1918 would eventually recognize what the austerity funding the military actually meant. Both pressures pointed in the same direction. Hitler understood this. His statements to his generals in the months before the invasion reveal a man who knew Germany wasn't ready in conventional military terms, and had concluded that waiting for readiness was a risk the economic situation wouldn't permit. The invasion of Poland wasn't the culmination of a plan that had run its course. It was the plan admitting it had reached its limit. The economic argument has a military counterpart, and it tells the same story in harder numbers. Admiral Erich Raeder had been building Germany's naval power since 1935. His Z-Plan, the program to construct a fleet capable of challenging British naval supremacy, was designed for completion in the mid-1940s at the earliest. When war came in September 1939, Raeder had 57 U-boats. 16 were fit for Atlantic operations. Karl Dönitz estimated he needed 300 to blockade Britain effectively. Raeder told Hitler directly, in writing, that the Navy could not win a war with Britain. In a conflict with the Royal Navy, it could do little more than die with honor. And that's just the sea. On land, the situation looks strong until you look closer. But the hardware was a different story entirely. Of the roughly 3,000 tanks the Wehrmacht deployed into Poland, over 1,400 were the Panzer I, a vehicle armed with 2 machine guns, essentially an armoured car, already obsolete by any serious military standard. Another 1,200 were the Panzer II, a light reconnaissance vehicle with a 20mm autocannon never intended to fight real armor. The genuine combat power of the invasion force rested on just over 300 medium tanks, and a significant portion of those were captured Czechoslovakian designs, the 35T and 38T. the Third Reich's most modern tanks in September 1939 were Czech. Which leads to the most dangerous number of all. Ammunition. Not 6 months, not even close. 6 weeks. That was Georg Thomas's calculation for how long German stockpiles would sustain serious high-intensity combat. A war of attrition, which is precisely what Britain and France were planning to fight, would exhaust German reserves before any decisive result could be achieved. Every decision, every campaign, every operational gamble had to be designed around one overriding constraint. The war had to end fast, because nothing Germany had could sustain a long one. The Luftwaffe completed this picture. In tactical terms, supporting army operations at short range. It was genuinely formidable. But a decision made 3 years earlier had quietly removed its most dangerous potential. On the 29th of April, 1936, the Air Ministry cancelled the Ural bomber, a long-range 4-engine aircraft that would have given Germany the ability to strike British industrial centres from the continent. Hermann Göring had dismissed the programme with characteristic bluntness, remarking that the Führer would never ask how big the bombers were, only how many there were. When Germany needed to coerce Britain through air power in 1940, it had a force optimized for the war it had already won, not the one it now needed to fight. Germany's senior commanders knew all of this. The debate inside the High Command in the summer of 1939 wasn't about whether the military was ready. It wasn't. The debate was whether Hitler could be persuaded to hold back. The economic answer made holding back look like the greater risk. Two men understood the full picture before 1930 had already risen after authority to change it had already risen and military Thomas had warned about Macht had nearly exhausted its stockpiles in 5 weeks against a nation it was supposed to destroy in days. At this point, the question isn't whether the Wehrmacht was prepared, it's whether Germany could afford not to fight. Then France collapsed in 6 weeks, and the mythology reassembled itself around the victory. The fall of France in 1940 appears to vindicate the timing in hindsight. Germany won, so the calculation must have been right. Historians increasingly argue this gets causality backwards. Germany won in France because French command culture collapsed in unpredicted ways, and the Ardennes gamble succeeded under conditions that favoured the attacker in a combination nobody could have guaranteed in advance. Had the Allied response to the Meuse crossing been 2 days faster, had the Panzer corridor been cut before it reached the coast, Germany would have found itself in exactly the long war its own planners had warned it couldn't survive. The economic clock would still have been running. The victory didn't prove the readiness. It obscured the desperation. The mythology describes a regime that chose its moment from a position of strength. The evidence describes something colder. This is not an argument that Hitler was irrational. The evidence suggests he understood the military risks precisely and concluded the economic risks of waiting were worse. His statements to his generals reflect a man who had made a cold calculation about which kind of catastrophe was survivable. He was wrong about the war. He may not have been wrong about the alternative. An economic collapse in 1939 exposed debt, hidden unemployment resurfacing, the gold fiction unraveling, might have ended the regime before the war did. What it wouldn't have done is kill 60 to 80 million people. What Germany had built required feeding. The only question was what it would consume. The war that reshaped the modern world wasn't launched from a position of confident strength. It was launched from a position of concealed desperation by a regime whose economic model required perpetual expansion and had run out of room to expand without fighting. The Wehrmacht's early victories made this invisible. Spectacular success retroactively justifies the gamble that produced it. But the gap between what Germany had in September 1939 and what a general European war would require was documented in real time by the men responsible for closing it, and never closed. So, did Hitler start the war when he did because he chose to, an opportunist who recognized a window and took it? Or because his own economic structure had narrowed his options until war was the only one that kept it running? Drop your answer below, like this video, and subscribe if this changed how you think about why the war started when it did. Thanks for watching.